Imagine you're a young Bundeswehr soldier, stationed at a remote training area in southern Germany. It's the early 2010s, and your unit is conducting routine maneuvers in the dense pine forests that border your base. The Schwarzwald region, the Black Forest, has always carried an air of mystery, with its thick canopy blocking out the sun and ancient folklore whispering of spirits and lost souls. But for modern soldiers, equipped with GPS, night vision, and strict protocols, it's just another training ground. Or so you think. Tonight's episode takes us to the Julius von Hock Kaserne, a real Bundeswehr installation near the town of Stetten am Kaltenmarkt in Baden-Württemberg. This base, part of the larger training complex in the Heuberg area, sits on the edge of vast forested ranges used for live fire exercises, land navigation, and survival training. Established in the post-war era and modernized over decades, it's home to infantry and artillery units. The surrounding forests stretch for miles, rugged terrain perfect for honing skills, but also isolated enough that, once you're deep in, help feels worlds away. Germany's military history runs deep here. The region saw heavy fighting in both world wars, and remnants of old bunkers and trenches still dot the landscape. But what we're exploring tonight isn't ancient history. These accounts come from serving Bundeswehr personnel in the 21st century. Men and women who pride themselves on discipline, rationality, and readiness. Yet, something in those woods has tested that resolve. Over the years, whispers have circulated within the ranks. Patrols that vanish for hours longer than planned, soldiers returning pale and silent, refusing to re-enter the forest. Commanders dismissing reports at first, only to grow alarmed when seasoned troops, guys who'd faced deployments in Afghanistan, flatly refuse orders to go back in. What could make trained soldiers panic like that? These stories were shared anonymously through military forums, private conversations, and a few brave enough to speak on record. Names and some details have been changed to protect identities, but the core experiences remain as told. We're treating these with the respect they deserve. No embellishment, just the raw testimonies of those who lived it. Tonight, we dive into 7 chapters of escalating encounters in the haunted barracks and the unforgiving forest beyond. What starts as odd noises in empty rooms builds to something far darker. Buckle up. This one's going to linger. Chapter 1. The empty room that wasn't empty. My name is Lucas, at least, that's what we'll call me here. I was a Gefreiter in an infantry company stationed at Julius von Hock Kaserne in the early 2010s. I'd only been with the unit a few weeks, still adjusting to the rhythm of garrison life after basic training. The base sits right on the edge of the Heuberg training area in Baden-Württemberg, and our barracks block backed directly onto the forest. From the third-floor windows you could see nothing but a wall of dark pines stretching out as far as the eye could follow, the tree line starting less than 50 meters from the building. The barracks themselves were typical post-reunification construction. Gray concrete, long echoing hallways, rooms designed for 4 soldiers, each with metal bunk beds, lockers, and a single window looking either toward the parade square or, in our case, straight into the Schwarzwald. The building had been renovated several times, but you could still feel its age in the way the floors creaked and the heating pipes groaned at night. My room was on the 3rd floor, end of the corridor. I shared it with 3 other guys, 2 who were often away on courses or weekend pass, and 1 who pulled frequent guard shifts. That left me alone more often than not in those first months. I didn't mind at first. Solitude was a luxury after the crowded barracks of basic. The first incident happened on a quiet weeknight. I'd turned in early after a long day of maintenance on the company vehicles. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the base's exterior lights filtering through the blinds. I was drifting in that half-sleep state when I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate boot steps that stopped and started, pacing back and forth past the doors. I figured it was the Unteroffizier vom Dienst making his rounds. Standard procedure. They check the building every couple of hours, making sure doors are secure and no one sneaking out or leaving stoves on. The pacing stopped right outside my door. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, measured knocks. "Ja, hierin," I called out, voice thick with sleep, expecting the door to open and the duty NCO to poke his head in for a quick look. Nothing. No response. No door opening. I waited a moment, then got up, flipped on the light, and opened the door myself. The hallway stretched empty in both directions under the harsh fluorescent lights. No one. Not even the faint sound of retreating footsteps. I stepped out, checked the stairwell at the end of the corridor, nothing. The whole floor felt deserted. I told myself I'd imagined it. Half dreaming, the mind fills in details. Went back to bed, left the light on for a while anyway. The next morning over breakfast, I mentioned it to my roommates. Schneider, the one who'd been there longest, just gave a knowing smile. "Ah, you met the Wanderer," he said. "Block 3 is famous for that. Happens to everyone eventually." I pressed him for details. He shrugged it off at first, but after some prodding he admitted that the footsteps and knocking were common on our floor. Some guys had learned to ignore it. Others slept with earplugs. No one had ever found an explanation. A few nights later it happened again. Same pattern. Pacing footsteps. Pause outside my door, 3 knocks. This time I was fully awake. I sat up immediately and called out, "Where is Da?" Still no answer. I opened the door faster. Hallway empty again. But something felt different. The air in the corridor was noticeably colder, like a draft from an open window in winter, even though all the windows were sealed shut. And as I stood there listening, I caught it whispering. Low, indistinct voices, overlapping, coming from somewhere further down the hall. The words were in German, but too muffled to make out clearly. I walked the length of the corridor, checking every door. All locked, all rooms supposedly occupied by sleeping soldiers. Yet not a sound from any of them. The whispering seemed to fade as I approached, then pick up again behind me when I turned around. By the time I got back to my room, my heart was pounding harder than it ever had on the obstacle course. I reported it to my Zugführer the next day during morning formation. He listened without expression, then said, "Get more sleep, Gefreiter. New soldiers always hear things. The forest plays tricks on the mind." That was the end of the official discussion. But it didn't stop. The incidents became more frequent. Sometimes just the footsteps. Sometimes the knocking. Once or twice the whispering was clearer, fragments like, "Bleib higher," or "Nicht hinaus, stay here, don't go out." Always when I was alone in the room. I started noticing other details. The temperature drops were consistent, always localized to the hallway outside my door. My roommates claimed they never experienced it when they were alone, only when the room was occupied by someone new. And then there were the dreams, vivid, recurring images of soldiers in old uniforms standing at the edge of the forest, watching the barracks, faces obscured by shadow. I began leaving my desk lamp on all night. Started timing how long I could go without looking toward the door when the footsteps started. Told myself it was nothing, just the stress of adjustment. The isolation of the base. The endless dark wall of trees outside the window pressing in. But deep down I knew it was only the beginning. The barracks were trying to tell us something, or warn us. And whatever it was, it hadn't even started with the forest yet. What was waiting out there in those pines that made the building itself feel occupied? Chapter 2. Whispers in the Pines. They told us the incidents in the barracks were just new guy nerves. Nothing more. I wanted to believe that. I really did. After a few weeks, the footsteps and knocking became background noise. Something I could push to the back of my mind and ignore while I focused on the real work of soldiering. Weapons handling, physical training, preparing for the field exercises that defined life at Heuberg. The forest training started soon after. The Schwarzwald pressed right up against the base perimeter, and the Heuberg training area extended deep into it. Thousands of hectares of steep, rocky hills covered in dense pine and fir. There were no civilian trails in the core zones we used. Once you crossed the fence line, you were in military territory only. The terrain was punishing. Thick undergrowth that tore at your uniforms, sudden drop-offs hidden by ferns, ravines that funneled sound in strange ways. It was perfect for teaching small unit tactics, land navigation, and survival. It was also isolated. Once you were a couple of kilometers in, the base felt like another world. Our first proper forest exercise was a standard daytime navigation march. 4-man teams, map and compass only. No GPS allowed for training purposes. We carried full field pack, rifles, and enough rations for 24 hours. My team was led by Obergefreiter Max Keller, a stocky, quiet soldier from Bavaria who had already done 2 tours in Afghanistan. The other 2 were solid guys I'd gotten to know in the barracks, Schneider from my room and a quiet Saxon named Ben. We inserted at the eastern gate just after dawn. The morning was crisp, the kind of cold that bites through your fleece even under combat jacket. Birds called overhead, and the smell of pine resin was thick in the air. For the first few kilometers, everything felt normal. We moved in bounding overwatch, called out bearings, marked waypoints on our maps. Max set a steady pace. No one was complaining. Around midday, we reached the halfway point of the planned loop. The forest had grown denser, the canopy blocking most of the sunlight so that the ground was dim and green-tinted. We stopped for a short break in a small clearing to check our position and eat a ration bar. That was when the fog rolled in. It came fast, unnaturally fast. 1 minute the air was clear. The next a thick gray mist was pouring through the trees from the north like someone had opened a valve. Visibility dropped to 20 meters, then 10. Sound changed too. Everything became muffled, as though the fog swallowed it. Max cursed under his breath and pulled out the compass. We formed a tight circle, rifles outward out of habit. "Bleib zusammen," he said quietly. "Stay together." That was when we heard the whispering. At first I thought it was wind moving through the branches, but it had rhythm, rising and falling like voices in conversation. The words were German, low and overlapping, too soft to make out clearly. It seemed to come from all around us, as if the trees themselves were speaking. Schneider looked at me, eyes wide. "Horst du das?" I nodded. We all did. Max raised a fist for silence and tilted his head, listening. The whispers continued, growing slightly louder, circling us. I caught fragments. "Zurich. Nicht weiter. Back. Don't go farther." Max scanned the tree line. "Another team nearby?" he asked. It made sense. Sound carried strangely in fog. Maybe a parallel group was calling coordinates. He cupped his hands and shouted, "Freundlich. Identifizieren." No answer. Only the whispers. Now closer. We pushed on, staying tight. The fog refused to lift. Every few minutes Max would halt us to recheck bearings. The compass needle swung steady at least, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hairs on my neck stood up the way they do when you know someone is staring at the back of your head in a quiet room. Then Max stopped dead. He raised a closed fist and we froze behind him. Ahead, through the swirling mist, shapes stood between the trunks. Human silhouettes, tall, motionless, spaced at regular intervals. They wore long coats and what looked like rounded helmets. Not modern gear. Not Bundeswehr. Max's voice was low. "Langsam Barucken. Waffen bereit, aber sicher." We advanced step by step, trying to make out details. The figures didn't move, didn't react. "Bundeswehr. Identifizieren Sie sich." Max called again. Nothing. We closed to maybe 15 meters. The shapes sharpened slightly. Definitely men in uniform. Greatcoats hanging to mid-calf. Stahlhelm silhouettes unmistakable. Faces lost in shadow. Then the fog shifted, and they were simply gone. No footsteps retreating. No rustle of branches. Just empty trees where a dozen men had been standing a heartbeat earlier. We stood there in silence for a long moment. Ben was the first to speak. "Was zum Teufel war das?" Max didn't answer right away. He stared at the spot a few more seconds, then shook his head. "Wider," he said finally. "Keep moving." We finished the loop without further incident. The fog lifted as abruptly as it had arrived once we neared the perimeter fence. Back at the base we reported the navigation times and route as required. When the debriefing officer asked if we'd encountered anything unusual, Max hesitated, then said only, "Dense fog, possible civilian hunters and restricted area." The officer nodded and moved on. That night in the barracks the footsteps returned, louder, more insistent. The knocking came twice, and for the first time, the whispers filtered through the closed door, faint but unmistakable. Max found me in the smoke pit later. He lit a cigarette with steady hands, but his eyes were troubled. "Those weren't hunters, Lucas," he said quietly. "Those uniforms. They were old. Too old." He didn't say anything more, and I didn't ask. But we both knew the forest had shown us something it didn't show everyone. And it wasn't finished with us yet. What happens when the whispers follow you out of the barracks and into the dark? Chapter 3. The patrol that lost time. After the navigation march with the fog and the silent figures. We all tried to put it behind us. Max told us privately to keep it quiet, said bringing up ghost stories in official reports would only earn us extra duties or a trip to the psych office. So we logged the exercise as routine, grabbed hot showers, and went back to the grind. But the forest had left its mark. Sleep came harder. The barracks' footsteps sounded heavier, like they carried purpose now. A couple of weeks later the company scheduled night patrol training. Exactly the kind of evolution that separates serious soldiers from the rest. Small teams, full kit, moving under night observation devices through the same deep grids we'd used before. The objective was simple: infiltrate to a mock observation post 8 kilometers in, conduct surveillance for 2 hours, then exfiltrate without detection. No live fire, no enemy force, just us against the terrain and the dark. Max volunteered to lead our team again. By now I trusted him completely. He'd kept his cool in real combat zones, and that counted for something. Schneider and Ben rounded out the 4-man element. We drew G36s, NODs, extra batteries, and the usual load. Insertion time was 2,200 hours. Moonless night, overcast sky, perfect conditions for stealth movement. We crossed the perimeter fence in single file, paused for a listening halt, then melted into the trees. The forest swallowed us immediately. Pine needles muffled our steps. The air smelled of damp earth and resin. For the first hour, everything felt textbook. We moved tactically, short bounds, hand signals, regular halts to scan and listen. Max navigated flawlessly with map, compass, and pace count. Then the whispers started. They crept in slowly, the same low, overlapping voices we'd heard in the fog. At first so faint, I thought it was blood rushing in my ears from the exertion. But the others heard it too. Max signaled halt, and we crouched in a tight perimeter. The voices grew clearer, drifting through the trunks. German words, old-fashioned cadence. I caught my own name once, Lucas, drawn out, almost pleading. Then Max's. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, impossible to locate. Max whispered, "Wind in the branches. Keep moving." We pressed on. Minutes later, the electronics began acting up. First, the NODs flickered, green static washing across the image intensifiers. Then the backup GPS units we carried for emergencies went haywire. Screens froze, rebooted, showed impossible coordinates deep in the Baltic Sea. Even the compasses started swinging lazily, as though the Earth's magnetic field had decided to take a break. Max called a halt again. Equipment malfunction across the board. We abort an RTB. Protocol said continue unless compromised, but common sense argued otherwise. He decided to push to the objective anyway. Better to complete the task and report the failures later than turn back prematurely. We adjusted to iron sights and pace count only. The whispers never stopped. They became almost conversational, urgent. Calm Zurich. Nicked wider. Gefahr. Come back. Don't go farther. Danger. The forest floor sloped downward into a broad clearing we didn't remember from the map study. Thick fog pooled there, ankle deep at first, then rising to our knees. In the center stood figures, more than before. At least a dozen, maybe 15. Perfectly still, spaced in 2 ranks like an old parade formation. Long greatcoats, rounded stallhelm, rifles slung. Faces hidden in shadow under the brim. We froze 20 meters away. Max's voice was steady but low. Hold fire. Observe. The figures didn't move, didn't breathe that we could see. Just watched us with that absolute stillness that feels wrong in living men. One stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Raised his right hand, palm open. Not a threat. More like a warning, or an invitation. Ben's breathing was ragged beside me. Das sind keine Übungskraft, he muttered. These aren't exercise troops. I felt it then. A pressure behind the eyes, a pull to walk forward. Like the air itself was tugging gently at my chest. Max broke the spell. Langsam Zurich. Keen Platzleichen Bewegungen. We retreated step by step, weapons trained, until the fog and trees hid the formation. Then we turned and moved fast, battle pace through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces. Time blurred. We ran until lungs burned and legs shook. When we finally broke through the perimeter wire and stumbled into the glow of the base lights, the eastern sky was pale with approaching dawn. We checked our watches in disbelief. Insertion at 2,200. Exfil now at nearly 0600. 12 hours gone for a 6-hour tasking. The duty officer met us at the gate, ready to tear into us for being overdue. But when he saw our faces, pale, streaked with dirt, eyes wide, he stopped short. Debrief was in the commander's office, door closed. Max gave the report straight. Equipment failures, disorientation and fog, possible civilian intrusion. The major listened without interrupting. When we finished, he leaned back, rubbed his temples. You're the 3rd team this rotation to report. Similar issues in that grid, he said quietly. Same clearing, same descriptions. He marked it officially as environmental disorientation due to unexpected weather. Privately, he added, "From now on, no night movements deeper than grid 47 to 82. Daylight only on less battalion level." We nodded, too drained to argue. That night none of us slept. The barracks corridors echoed with boots marching in perfect unison, though every room on the floor was accounted for, and the whispers followed us even there, slipping under the door like smoke. How do you explain losing half a day in the dark? Standing before soldiers who shouldn't exist. Chapter 4. The soldier who didn't return. The lost time patrol changed everything. Word spread through the company like smoke under a door, quiet, unstoppable. Soldiers who had laughed off the earlier stories now spoke in lowered voices in the smoke pit or the mess hall. The older hands, the ones with hash marks on their sleeves from multiple postings, started sharing their own fragments. A patrol in the 90s that found fresh boot prints leading into a ravine and never coming out. Unexplained lights moving parallel to night marches. Radios picking up faint German commands in an accent no one used anymore. Command tried to keep control. More daylight-only training. Tighter accountability checks. Mandatory buddy system even for simple boundary walks. But the forest didn't care about schedules. Then Jonas disappeared. Stabsgefreiter Jonas Weber was one of those soldiers every unit needs. Reliable, calm under pressure. The kind of guy who volunteered for the worst details without complaining. He'd been at Heuberg longer than most of us. Knew the grids like his own backyard. On paper, he was the last person you'd expect to get lost. The exercise was routine. Solo land navigation, daylight hours, 10 checkpoints over 15 kilometers. Jonas signed out at the operations tent with his map, compass, rifle, and radio. He checked in at the first 3 points on schedule, short, professional transmissions. Checkpoint Driereich, Ailsklar. Then the fourth at 1400 hours. After that, silence. When he missed the 1600 check-in, the duty officer raised an eyebrow but waited. Soldiers sometimes took longer fixing a bearing or crossing rough terrain. By 1800, with no sign and no response on repeated calls, the alert went out. Search parties formed. First his own platoon, then reinforced with dogs and a helicopter once dusk fell. The forest swallowed the sound of rotors and barking. They found nothing that first night. Jonas walked out on his own at 0200 the next morning, emerging from the tree line near the eastern fence like he was returning from a casual stroll. Except he wasn't strolling. He was sitting, back against a pine, knees drawn up, staring straight ahead. His rifle lay across his lap, safety on, not a round fired. His uniform was clean, no tears, no mud beyond normal. But his face was gray, eyes bloodshot and fixed. Medics checked him immediately. No hypothermia, no dehydration, no injuries. Physically perfect. Mentally, he wouldn't speak, wouldn't even blink when they shone lights in his eyes. Just stared into the middle distance as if watching something the rest of us couldn't see. They carried him to the sick bay on a stretcher because he refused to stand. For 3 full days he said nothing. Not a word to the doctors, the psychologists, the commander who sat with him privately. He ate when food was put in his mouth, drank when a cup was held to his lips. But otherwise he was a statue. On the 4th day he started talking, but only in short bursts, and only when someone asked direct questions. "They wouldn't let me leave," he said, voice flat. "I kept walking, but the trees moved. Same clearing. Over and over. Hours. Days. I don't know." He described the figures. Dozens now, formed up in perfect ranks. Old uniforms, greatcoats heavy with dew that never fell, Stahlhelm casting shadows that hid their faces completely. They didn't threaten, didn't speak aloud, but the message was clear in the way they stood between him and every possible exit. "Don't come back," he whispered at one point, repeating it like he'd heard it 1,000 times. "This is our forest now. You don't belong." The official report read acute stress reaction with environmental factors. Jonas was medevaced to the military hospital in Ulm for full evaluation. A week later he was transferred out of the brigade entirely. New posting, far from any forest. We never heard from him again. Some guys tried reaching out later. Letters came back and opened. After Jonas, the commanders stopped pretending. Exercises deep in the restricted grids were cancelled without explanation. Patrol routes shifted to the edges. When someone asked why information, the answer was always the same clipped response: operational security. But the barracks reacted too. The activity that had been sporadic now felt constant. Footsteps at all hours. Measured, military cadence, marching up and down empty corridors. Doors that had been secure suddenly stood ajar. One soldier on my floor woke to find a figure standing at the foot of his bunk. Tall, helmeted, coat dripping water that wasn't there when he turned on the light. The man screamed loud enough to bring half the floor running. By the time we arrived, the room was empty, floor dry. But the cold lingered, sharp as January air. Morale began to crack in quiet ways. Guys requested leave more often. Sick call numbers rose. Experienced NCOs started counting days until rotation like new recruits. And still the forest waited, patient as centuries of pine. What happens when even the most reliable soldier comes back broken? And the chain of command can no longer ignore it. Chapter 5. Refusal of orders. After Jonas came back broken, the atmosphere in the company shifted from uneasy jokes to something heavier. You could feel it in the way conversation stopped when an officer walked into the room. In the way guys lingered longer over coffee in the mess hall, putting off the moment they had to head out to the training areas. No one talked openly about quitting or transferring. That kind of thing could kill a career. But the requests for leave spiked. And the sick bay saw a steady stream of complaints about headaches, insomnia, stomach issues. Anything to avoid another night near the tree line. Command scheduled a large battalion-level exercise anyway. They called it a readiness check, a chance to practice company-sized maneuvers before the next inspection cycle. Multiple platoons would be in the forest at once, perimeter security details, reconnaissance teams, a mock quick reaction force. It was the biggest movement into the deeper grid since Jonas. Officially, the restricted zones were still off limits, but the exercise boundary skirted right up against them. My platoon drew outer perimeter security on the northern sector, deep enough that the base lights disappeared behind the ridges within the first hour. We set up in a series of two-man listening posts and roving patrols, dug shallow scrapes, laid out comms wire, and settled in for a long night. Max was with me on one of the static posts. Schneider and Ben handled a patrol route that looped nearby. The first few hours were quiet. Cold, but quiet. We rotated watch, brewed tea on a small hexamine stove, spoke in whispers. Then the whispers started, not ours. They came from the forest side, low at first, then building. The same overlapping voices, the same old German cadence. This time they carried farther, as though the trees were amplifying them. Every listening post reported the same thing over the platoon net. Faint voices on bearing 090, depth unknown. Our lieutenant came over the radio comm as ever. Probably echo from another company. Maintain noise discipline and report any visual contact. But the voices grew more distinct. Names again. First names, last names, ranks. Soldiers from our own platoon, called clearly through the dark. Then orders in archaic phrasing. Antreton and Lenny Marsh. Max and I exchanged looks. The temperature dropped sharply. Breath fogging though the night had been mild. Frost formed on the pine needles around our position. Then the shapes appeared. Not a dozen this time. Dozens. Moving parallel to our perimeter on the inside of the tree line, silent, spaced at perfect intervals, keeping exact pace with our roving patrols. Whenever a patrol changed direction, the shapes adjusted, mirroring the movement like a reflection. Schneider's voice cracked over the radio first. Post tree higher. We're having multiple visual contact. Keen modern and uniformen. See Fulgenons. One by one, every team reported the same. No one fired. There was nothing solid enough to engage. And the rules of engagement for an exercise didn't cover ghosts. But the reports kept coming, overlapping, urgent. The lieutenant ordered all posts to hold position and maintain observation. Standard procedure for unidentified personnel. That was when the refusal started. A squad from 2nd Platoon, veterans, guys who'd done Kunduz and Mazar-i-Sharif, keyed the net. Their sergeant's voice was flat, final. Zwo null higher. We're exfiltrieren jetzt. We're bleiben nicht. The lieutenant repeated the order. Hold position. Await further instructions. The response came back immediate. Negative, Herr Lieutenant. We're common Zurich and Semmelpunkt. End. Static. Then another team chimed in with the same. Within minutes, half the perimeter teams were packing gear and moving back toward the assembly area. Not running, disciplined withdrawal, covering each other, but refusing to stay. I looked at Max. He shook his head slowly. If they're going, we're going. We broke down the post, rolled the wire, and started the march back. Behind us the whispers rose to a murmur like a crowd, almost triumphant. When we reached the assembly point near the fence line, the scene was controlled chaos. Soldiers grouped by platoons, faces pale under the red lens flashlights, speaking in low, clipped sentences. Some were shaking. A few sat on their packs with heads and hands. These weren't recruits. These were hardened infantrymen, men who'd taken incoming fire without flinching. Yet here they were, refusing direct orders for the first time in their careers. The company commander, an Oberstleutnant known for his iron discipline, arrived with the operations staff. He walked the lines, speaking quietly to each platoon leader. I watched his face as the reports came in. The calm mask cracked, just for a second. Eyes narrowed, jaw tight. He knew exactly what this meant. Mass refusal in the face of the enemy was one thing. Mass refusal because of ghosts was something the Bundeswehr had no doctrine for. Debrief lasted until dawn, conducted in the heated operations tent instead of the open field. Every team gave the same account. Voices calling names. Old formations pacing the line. Overwhelming sense of being watched and warned. No one embellished. The stories matched too perfectly for exaggeration. At the end, the Oberstleutnant stood, looked over the room full of exhausted soldiers, and spoke only once. This exercise is terminated. All units return to garrison. No further discussion outside this tent. He didn't call it hysteria. Didn't threaten punishment. Just ended it. That night, the barracks erupted. Footsteps thundered in corridors that security sweeps confirmed empty. Doors slammed and sequenced down entire floors. One entire wing reported hearing measured commands barked in pre-war German, Achtung. Still just standing, echoing from the basement, though the basement lights showed nothing but stored equipment and bare concrete. Sleep became impossible. The building felt alive, angry. Command canceled all forest training for the following week. Routes were redrawn to the open ranges farther south. Psychological support teams arrived quietly, chaplains, stress counselors. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but the lines were long. We all knew the restrictions wouldn't last forever. The army needed the terrain. But for the first time, the chain of command had blinked. What do you do when trained soldiers obey something older than orders? And the forest starts winning. Chapter 6. The night the forest called, the battalion exercise refusal bought us a brief reprieve. Training shifted to the open artillery ranges south of the base, flat, windswept ground, where the only trees were lonely pines along the impact area boundary. No one complained. For a week the barracks settled into an uneasy quiet. Footsteps rarer, whispers faint enough to dismiss as wind through cracked windows. We told ourselves the restrictions were working, that whatever lingered in the forest had lost interest now that we stayed away. Then the storm hit. It rolled in from the southwest on a Friday night. Black clouds stacking like artillery barrages. Wind howling through the pines hard enough to rattle the barracks' windows in their frames. Thunder echoed off the ridges. Lightning strobed white across the parade square. Power flickered twice, then died completely just after midnight. The entire base plunged into darkness. Emergency red lights kicking on in the corridors. Generators humming to life for critical systems only. I was pulling watchdienst that rotation, guard duty, with Max. We sat in the small guard shack at the main gate, lanterns glowing, monitoring the motion sensors along the northern perimeter fence that faced the forest. The storm made everything unreliable. Sensors tripping from wind-blown branches, radio comms crackling with static. The duty officer had told us to log anything unusual, but not to investigate unless it was a clear breach. Around 0130 the alarms went off, multiple sensors along the tree line. Sequential triggers moving west to east like footsteps. Max checked the monitor. Could be deer, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the forest edge for a frozen second. In that white glare we saw them. Lights. Dozens of pale, bobbing orbs deep among the trunks, moving in slow procession. Not flashlights, too steady, too low to the ground, flickering like old lanterns. Then the voices came. Not whispers this time. Full voices, carried on the wind despite the howling gale. Hundreds of them layered, rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Old marching cadences, songs I'd only heard in history documentaries. Voices rough with pre-war accents. Einmal nach Vorn, Kameraden. Vorwärtsmarsch. Max, and I stared through the rain-streaked window. The lights kept pace, weaving between trees, drawing closer to the fence. Then the calling started. Names, clear as if spoken right outside the shack. Lucas Keller. Enter 10. My name first, then Max's. Then others, soldiers from our company, from the battalion. One by one, called in measured order like morning roll call. Max gripped the edge of the table. Do you hear that? I nodded, throat dry. The pull hit harder than before, a physical tug behind the sternum, urging me to stand, to open the door, to walk out into the storm. The radio crackled, other guard posts reporting the same. Lights in the forest, voices calling names, overwhelming compulsion to approach. The duty officer's voice cut through the static. All posts acknowledge. Hold position. Do not, repeat, do not enter the tree line. Maintain security of the gate. Max keyed the mic. We're standing. Holding. But the voices grew louder, intimate now, almost gentle, promising warmth, rest, belonging. Lightning flashed again. For a heartbeat the forest was daylight bright. The lights resolved into figures, hundreds, formed in perfect columns. Old greatcoats dark with rain that didn't seem to touch them, helmets gleaming. They stood just beyond the fence, faces still shadowed, arms at their sides, waiting. The compulsion spiked. My hand moved to the door handle without conscious thought. Max grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise. Lucas, look at me. I forced my eyes to his. He was pale, sweating despite the cold leaking through the walls. We stay here, he said, together. We backed away from the window, sat with rifles across our knees, staring at the floor. The voices continued for another 20 minutes, calling, singing, pleading. Then, as suddenly as the storm had arrived, the wind dropped. The voices faded into ordinary rain on the roof. Power returned at 0400. The sensors showed no further triggers. Dawn Patrol found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign anyone, or anything, had been near the fence. But the damage was done. Morning formation revealed 2 soldiers missing from their rooms. Both had been seen turning in for the night. Both were found hours later, miles deep in the forest, sitting calmly against trees as if waiting for pickup. They claimed to have followed the voices, said the calls promised to take them home. Neither could explain how they'd crossed locked gates and razor wire without a trace. Both were transferred out within days. Quiet medical discharges. No details released. Command reacted fast this time. The northern perimeter received permanent floodlights and additional sensors. Night training near the forest was banned indefinitely. Psychological support became mandatory for any unit that had been on the base longer than 6 months. The chaplains worked overtime. Max and I never talked about that night directly again. But we both requested transfers the following month. Got them approved without question. The forest had called, and some had answered. What remains when the storm passes? And the voices still echo in your head. Chapter 7. Echoes that remain. I left the Bundeswehr a few months after that storm. The transfer came through quietly. No questions asked. No black marks on the record. Max got out around the same time. We lost touch the way soldiers often do when the shared experience becomes too heavy to revisit casually. Civilian life pulled me in different directions. University, a job in logistics, a family eventually. The forest felt like a closed chapter, something I could file away with the rest of the deployment memories. Intense, formative, but behind me. Yet the echoes never fully faded. Years later, out of curiosity more than anything else, I reached out to a few old comrades through social media or mutual contacts. The stories were still there, quieter now but consistent. New rotations arriving at Julius von Hock Kaserne would hear the footsteps in the barracks within their first weeks. Young soldiers on their initial forest exercises would report whispers in the pines. Compasses acting strange, fleeting shapes in the fog. The restricted grids remained marked on the maps, boundaries pushed farther out each year under various official pretexts. Environmental protection, unexploded ordnance surveys, wildlife conservation. No one challenged it openly. One former Hauptfeldwebel told me that the deeper zones were now used only for drone testing and occasional special forces insertions. Units that came and went without mixing with the regular garrison troops. Even then, he said, the SF guys respected the unofficial rules. Daylight only, no solo movement. Immediate exfil if anomalies were reported. He'd heard of one team that ignored the warnings. They came back subdued, Requested reassignment the next day. The barracks building we lived in, Block 3, was renovated again in the late 2010s. New windows, modern heating, brighter lighting in the corridors. The footsteps stopped for a while, or so the story went. But after the construction crews left, they returned, subtler now, less aggressive. More like a reminder than a threat. Soldiers adapted the way we always do. Earplugs, white noise apps on phones, unspoken agreements not to acknowledge it aloud. Some tried to explain it rationally. Mass suggestion amplified by the isolation and the weight of history. The Heuberg area had seen brutal training in both world wars. Wehrmacht recruits pushed to breaking point. Waffen-SS units drilling in these same woods. Remnants of old bunkers and firing trenches still hidden under the moss. Stress, sleep deprivation, and the power of shared storytelling could create powerful illusions. Fog and wind carried sound in unpredictable ways. Cold spots were just drafts from poor insulation. Others believed something else entirely. That the forest holds on to what it claims. That soldiers who fell here through exhaustion, accident, or worse, never fully left. That they watched the new generations with a mix of warning and resentment. Don't repeat our mistakes. Don't come deeper. This ground is ours now. I don't know which explanation is true. Maybe both. Maybe neither. What I do know is this. Every time I drive through southern Germany and see those dark pine walls rising along the Autobahn, I feel it again. The prickle at the back of the neck. The involuntary glance in the rearview mirror. I've never stopped at Stettin am Kaltenmarkt. Never taken the exit toward Heuberg. Some boundaries you learn not to cross twice. The Black Forest keeps its secrets the way it keeps its shadows. Patient, eternal, unforgiving. If you ever find yourself stationed there, pulling guard on a quiet night, listening to boots echo down an empty hallway, respect it. Log it if you must, but don't dismiss it. And if the wind through the pines starts to sound like voices calling your name, turn back. What lingers in those woods that even the modern German army fears to confront?